Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Susan Cheka-Lusignan, Director of Marketing and Program Development for the Friends and Foundation of the Rochester Public Library. We welcome you to Book Sandwiched In. Thank you. We ask that you please silence your cell phones at this time. Our thanks go to those who help fund programs like these through FFRPL, the dedicated FFRPL committee members who curate and organize these events, our guest speakers who so graciously share their time and talents with us, the library staff who help with our setup and production, and the thousands of people who attend each year, in person and online. We are live streaming the formal portion of today's program to the library's YouTube channel at Rochester Public Library, New York. If you need to access the induction loop service in the auditorium, please adjust your hearing aid to the T switch. FFRPL raises funds, presents programs, supports special projects, helps to create specialized spaces, and purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the Rochester Public Library. We also manage restricted funds that provide supplemental materials support to 62 eligible libraries in Monroe, Ontario, Wayne, Livingston, Orleans, and Genesee counties. We raise funds through our annual campaign, capital campaigns, grants, planned gifts, and revenue from book sales on site and online. We present programs like today's Book Sandwiched In Review. We support projects like Central's signature Art of the Book and Paper exhibit on view through November 15th across the street in the Rundell building, and FFRPL is a founding sponsor of that exhibit. We help to create specialized spaces such as RPL Go, the library's new mobile unit. FFRPL provided financial support for RIT students to create product prototypes for the vehicle and bought a set of laptops for that specialized space. And finally, FFRPL purchases supplemental materials and equipment for the library for resources like Central's VIP Pass Explorer kits, which now include added materials that patrons can use when visiting the Memorial Art Gallery, Rochester Museum and Science Center, Corning Museum of Glass, and Sonnenberg Gardens. And thanks to our donors who make our work possible. Today, Mitch Gruber will review Abundance by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. Klein and Thompson claim that, quote, the story of America in the 21st century is the story of chosen scarcities. In the introduction, the authors imagine the year 2050, and they describe it this way. The world has changed, not just the virtual world, that dance of pixels on our screens, the physical world too, its houses, its energy, its infrastructure, its medicines, its hard tech. How different this era is from the beginning decades of the 21st century, which unspooled a series of braided crises, a housing crisis, a financial crisis, a pandemic, a climate crisis, political crises. For years, we accepted homelessness and poverty and untreated disease and declining life expectancy. For years, we knew what we needed to build to alleviate the scarcities so many faced and to create the opportunities so many wanted, and we simply didn't build it. For years, we failed to invent and implement technology that would make the world cleaner, healthier, and richer. For years, we constrained our ability to solve the most important problems. Why? As Foodlink's Chief Impact Officer, Mitch Gruber has the opportunity to lead many innovative, nationally renowned programs like the Curbside Market and Career Fellowship. And the library's connection to Foodlink is important. Central Library is proud to be the site of the Foodlink Community Cafe, which launched here in 2021 with a mission-driven, pay-it-forward restaurant concept and the primary goal of providing training opportunities for Foodlink's culinary apprentices. All proceeds support Foodlink's mission of ending hunger and building healthier communities. In addition to his leadership role with Foodlink, Mitch Gruber also serves as a city council member, and he holds a PhD in American history from the University of Rochester. Please join me in welcoming Mitch Gruber to our podium.
afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Audio's good. Great. It's not lost on me, the irony is not lost on me that this book is a lot about technology and the importance of technology in growing our future, and I didn't bring any slides, and in fact only brought a piece of loose leaf paper. So I recognize the irony, but I'll do the best I can with what I have. I appreciate the introduction. Actually, the job that I have that was not referenced, my fault for not including it, was I also teach local government at the University of Rochester. I started that a couple years ago after being a city council member for about 5 or 6 years. They asked me to teach a class. And there's been great interest from students across the university. It's a small class, but it always fills up, and I've had really, really good interaction with students. And I regularly, for the past several years, ask them to read Ezra Klein, to listen to Derek Thompson, also to listen to Ezra Klein. They're both, I'm not a big podcast guy, as evidenced by the loose leaf paper, but if there's any two podcasts that I listen to, it is Klein's and Thompson's separately. And for those who don't know, Ezra Klein is a really prominent writer with a pretty, he's my age, he's only maybe 40, 41. But he's been writing for a long time on the national stage for a long time. He's currently at the New York Times, and Derek Thompson is currently at the Atlantic. And they're both really great writers, and I give them a great deal of credit for writing this book, Abundance. Before I jump into it, let me also just give a word of thanks to the friends. This is to Donna, to Susan, to the whole team. This is a really wonderful event, and I'm so grateful to be invited and grateful to all of you spent your time today listening. So as I was saying, I give Klein and Thompson a lot of credit because they put out a book that they recognized was a really big project. They talked about it as being something that was intended to kind of create a new political paradigm. And as always, especially right now in 2025, when you put out a big idea, you can be rest assured you're going to get a whole lot of flack for it. And it is true that this book has actually been really a lightning rod. There's just a ton of criticism around it, and I'll get to some of the criticism toward the end, but the criticism has been from the left, which is where Thompson and Klein believe they belong, and I believe they belong. There's been a lot of criticism from the left, criticism from the right, criticism from the center. They have not been shielded from criticism, but I give them so much credit because at the end of the day, it is, and this book is really all about this concept, it is very easy to destroy and demolish things. It is very difficult to build and develop things. And by the way, I learned this about 13 years ago when I bought my first house from the 1880s in the Susan B. Anthony neighborhood. And I thought to myself, I was in my mid-20s, I'm going to buy this house, I'm going to learn how to do all these different crafts, I'm going to get really good at this stuff. And boy, was I good at the demolition part. It was really easy to give me a hammer and let me knock some walls down. But when you try to build and be a craftsperson and develop new things, it is really difficult. And I eventually, as I hope you can guess at this point, hired people to do that part of it. And so, you know, at the end of the day, I think that some of the criticism of Klein and Thompson's book is very valid, and I'll go through some of that at the end. But I also give them a great deal of credit for putting out a platform that I think is very, very useful. Pardon me. And I'll also say that, you know, as I mentioned, I teach local government. I'm a practitioner of local government. And I think that when you read this book through the lens of local government, a lot of the criticism that came of it, and that we'll talk about later, I think kind of fades away. Much of the criticism around this book was that it doesn't offer a big enough or robust enough national scope. And I think those are very valid concerns, and those are very valid criticisms. But in all three of my jobs, whether it's helping to lead the food bank here, being a city council member, or teaching local government, in all three of those spaces, I unfortunately have to deal with what I always talked about with my students as the layers of government. It's more than a 7-layer dip, right? There are so many different layers, and we have to touch so many different things and find different ways to wade through complicated processes. And so none of this stuff is easy. But again, I think that it's incredibly important that Klein and Thompson offered this perspective. And I'm gonna tell you what I really think is helpful about it, is that right on page 4, for anyone who's following along, right on page 4, They say right out front what their thesis is, what their argument is. So I'll read it for you. It's a very simple, quick statement. This book is dedicated to a simple idea. To have the future we want, we need to build and invent more of what we need. That's it. That's the purpose of the book. And I think there, again, we'll get into the criticism, but the book then goes into 5 chapters. I'll touch a little bit on each of the 5 chapters. I'm going to do my best to tie some things to local things that have happened here, at least in a couple of situations. And then I'll stop and pause for some questions for folks and make sure everyone's out of here on time, or Bill McDonald will have my hat. So in the introduction, after they talk about their thesis, they do go into a little bit of the history. Again, I think a very valid criticism is that this book is not rooted nearly enough in history. There's a whole lot about the New Deal that could have and should have been in this. It's also a 200-page book, which is part of their goal. I mean, if they wanted to make it a 1,000-page book and make it a history of the New Deal, they could have. They chose not to, and I don't blame them for making that decision. But one thing that I think is very instructive is in the introduction, they talk a good deal about one of the challenges right now with leftist politics, according to them, and progressive politics at the national level, is that so much of the policy has been around how do we give people access to dollars to spend on things that they otherwise can't afford in the free market, right? So this is what SNAP benefits are, right? People don't have enough money to make ends meet, so we give people SNAP benefits. This is what Section 8 is. People don't have enough money to pay rent, so we ultimately give people money to pay rent. And they say very clearly they're not against those things, and if they were, I'd be panning this book because I think that SNAP benefits and Section 8 are important programs. But their philosophy and their perspective is those things by themselves are not enough. We have to focus on how to build more of these things. Ultimately, housing would be cheaper if there was more housing produced. And I don't think that's an overly controversial statement whatsoever. It follows the laws of supply and demand. And their perspective is, why are we spending so much time thinking about how to give people money and not stop that, but why are we not also focusing on how to build more of the stuff that we need? And that's really what this book is all about. It's about a focus on production, not consumption. And I think that's a really useful paradigm. So we'll go through each of the 5 chapters, and it starts, I think, probably you'll see that I'll spend a waning amount of time on them as it gets into scientific innovation, which is not where my personal background is. I'm not going to offer you a whole lot of additional insight there. But the first chapter is about housing. It's called Grow. And I think the housing chapter is really, really important, and I think that it is probably the single place where they have the most personal expertise. And so I want to read a couple of segments from this first chapter. Anyone following along, I'm going to read just a little bit from page 23. Housing follows the laws of supply and demand. When supply is thick and demand is light, prices fall. The average home in Cleveland sells for about $115,000. When supply is tight and demand is hot, prices rise. That is the story of the pricey blue cities listed above. America used to be adept at building homes. In 1950, the U.S. Census Bureau reported that America had added 8.5 million units in the previous decade, even with the interruption of a world war. This is the greatest numerical growth on record, the authors announced. But in the late 1970s, home construction started to fall behind the pace of population growth. New permits per capita declined in the 1980s and again in the 1990s. After the Great Recession, the housing market crashed and home construction in the 2010s was obliterated. Today, the average number of dwellings per 1,000 people in the developed world is about 470, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Let me say that again. The average number of dwellings per 1,000 people in the developed world is about 470. France and Italy have nearly 600. Japan and Germany have about 500. The US has about 425. Where did all the houses go? The answer is that they were never built at all. So this is ultimately the crux of their argument in chapter 1, is that we have not built enough housing, nearly enough housing. And I want to link that to some things around local government and local politics here in Rochester. But let me first also, just to further illustrate their point, I think there's a really important note here on page 32. Consider the fortunes of janitors and lawyers. Janitors and lawyers, and this is from a study done by Peter Ganong and Daniel Shoag. Janitors and lawyers have long made more money working in New York than in the Deep South. As a result, many migrated from the Deep South to New York. But as housing costs in New York rose, the benefits of migration crumbled, at least for the janitors. The lawyers still came out ahead, but the janitors saw housing consume more than 50% of their paychecks. It used to be that both high-wage and low-wage workers moved from poorer areas to richer ones. By the 1990s, poorer workers were moving away from high-income areas and from the opportunities they once offered. I think that's, again, a really telling point that, and a lot of this that I didn't talk about was how this is rooted in politics for Klein and Thompson, because the reality is that the two states with the highest rate of homelessness, the two states that are doing, in many ways, the worst when it comes to housing construction are New York and California. Arguably the two bluest, most progressive cities in the country. Meanwhile, the state that is leading the way in housing production and in population growth is Texas. So their question, again, as two people who believe they are firmly planted and rooted in progressive politics, is why are we making it harder to build in the places that we live and the places that we vote in leadership? But in places where the Republican Party is in charge, is it so much easier? So they give a whole lot of different arguments, but one that I think is particularly important to talk about is what they call lawn sign liberalism. And they talk a great deal about all these different communities across the country that have signs up in their front yard that espouse progressive politics. Everyone's welcome here, we value science here, you all know the signs, you've all seen the signs, they exist everywhere. But oftentimes, in those very same neighborhoods and communities is where there are active arguments that, whether people mean them to be or not, become NIMBY arguments, NIMBY meaning not in my backyard. And I would say that the single best example of this in my 8 years on city council came from month 4 on the job, where I really learned pretty quickly about how challenging local politics could be. But it was the construction of new senior affordable housing units in Cobbs Hill, which many of you may have seen now are phase 1 and phase 2 are done. Even the very people who were wildly against it have since occasionally told me how they look pretty good, not as bad as I thought they were going to look, doesn't obstruct my views of the park, which is a lot of what the initial arguments were about. But when Cobbs Hill Village, I won't go into all the detail because I'll run out of time and I want to leave time for questions. But when Cobbs Hill Village was proposed by a nonprofit housing developer, first of all, there were already apartments there. And the apartments, by the way, were originally the site of a POW camp in Rochester, believe it or not. Some of you may remember the POW camp in Rochester. It was right in Cobbs Hill, right at the corner of Monroe and, I guess not on Culver, but right there off the corner. Small, one-story, largely cinder block and brick buildings. And so the nonprofit property developer came to the city before it was on city council and said, hey, we want to demolish those because they simply are not going to last. And not only that, but they're not fit for older adults right now. And I happen to know that to be true because there was a gentleman who I visited regularly when I was getting bar mitzvah, and we used to wheel to synagogue every Saturday. You remember him, Sue? Mr. Schifrin? Remember Mr. Schifrin? Yeah? Who I used to wheel to synagogue every Saturday in his wheelchair. You could not get a wheelchair in and out of those doors unless you spun him around and went in a perfect line backwards, because these were cinder, you couldn't expand the doorway. These were cinder block doorways built before we had the wheelchairs of today or the walkers of today. It simply was not appropriate housing for older adults. And so this company said, you know what? We want to demolish these. It was about 60 units. We want to add 40 some odd units. We want to make 100 plus units. We want to maintain affordability, although recognize they would be more expensive than the current buildings because there were a whole lot of additional amenities, building costs, et cetera. But they would all be, according to HUD and according to the city, affordable in various different income levels. And by the way, got me? I didn't do anything different. Got me? You guys can hear me okay? Okay. The organization did not ask for a penny from the city. They did not, in fact, the only thing they were asking for is to extend the zoning agreement we had with them, and they were actually going to pay us a little bit more in land usage. There was not a single dollar going to the organization. Well, there was a fight put up, largely by very many of the groups that are identified in this very book. The Sierra Club argued that this was a crime against environmentalism because we were building in a park. Many of the neighbors who live nearby argued that this was something that was completely unacceptable. And the argument I kept hearing over and over again is, why do you have to build there? Isn't there somewhere else to build? Which, by the way, when you look at affordable housing in Rochester, the vast majority of it is in very low-income neighborhoods. You know what that's called? Concentrating poverty. You know what we need to do less of? Concentrating poverty. And yet, here was a proposal asking the city to do nothing but extend a zoning code. And the amount of pressure and the kind of, frankly, smear campaign there was by neighbors in and around the Cobbs Hill neighborhood, by environmental groups, ultimately led to this: a multitude of lawsuits that cost everyone, both the developer, not the city, thankfully, but the developer and the neighborhood groups, thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars in lawyers' fees. The project took 4 extra years to actually happen because it was held up in legal limbo for so long. But guess what? The project still happened. It's beautiful. The neighbors are very happy about it. The residents are very happy about it. And the only thing that we lost in the meantime was time and money. But that's really so much of what their book is about. That we have created death by red tape. And we have given far too much autonomy and authority to small special interest groups who ultimately, I like the Sierra Club. I'm not against what the Sierra Club believes in. We're going to talk shortly about climate change in chapter 2. You know, I recently got my first electric vehicle, and I'm so happy to have an electric vehicle. And we're going to talk a little bit about the electric vehicle charging framework, which is a big part of their book as well. I believe in environmental causes. I don't believe that cutting down a small handful of trees, all of which were replaced, by the way, in the new project, that doesn't mean that it's the same trees. I understand trees have life. I get that. I don't think knocking down a couple of trees, and it really was a small handful, is worth preventing us from building 40 additional units of affordable senior housing. And if you do believe that, not you in the room, but you collectively, if you do believe that, then you are against the spirit of this book, which is, what do we need to do to build more stuff? Every single one of us in this room, I promise you, drives by various vacant lots in the city and wonders, why isn't there anything there? And the answer typically is because someone, and it's oftentimes government, by the way, which we'll get to shortly, someone has made it difficult to put something there. And the whole ethos of this book is that we need to do everything we can in our power to stop making it so complicated to build things like Cobbs Hill Village, and to stop letting things get caught up in legal limbo land. A couple other points on chapter 1. I'll just point to page 37, and I'll just read the very first sentence of a quote they give from a book. I'm going to forget what the book was called, but page 37, they're quoting a book that says, "A slew of new zoning laws in Westchester County, New York, reduced the maximum permissible population of the county by 1.4 million people, largely by banning forms of home construction other than large lot, single-family houses." This is what happens time and time and time again, is that unfortunately people say, I don't want big apartment buildings. And so much of this is, we have to be honest, they talk about it in their book regularly, so much of it is rooted in people legitimately having their biggest investment in their house. People's homes are their single biggest asset, and people are very nervous and scared all the time about things that are going to reduce the value of their house. But again, individuals' concerns about their property value, I don't think can trump the public good of building more quality homes for more people. And that is going to require us to have 4- and 5-story buildings at times. And the last thing on this chapter is they go into a great amount of depth about environmental protection. I mentioned the Sierra Club and how at times the very goals of the left, protecting the environment and hopefully having more quality, affordable housing for people, are at odds with each other. And I'll just read one quote from there. Between 1972 and 1975, 29,000 proposed homes in the Bay Area, roughly a fifth of the region's total housing production at the time, were subject to environmental litigation under SEQA, which is their Environmental Quality Protection Act, where every property has to go through a SEQA review. In New York, we call it seeker, but it's the same concept, that these projects have to go through environmental review. 1/5 of them were caught up in litigation. And so much of these examples are people will litigate by saying, well, there's a protected species in this area, and you can't do construction because of this protected species. And then it becomes a wild goose hunt to figure out, is there a protected species? What is it? Is this going to actually impact their environment? And you can see this just makes projects take years and years and cost lots of money, and not everyone has the appetite to do those things. So we're going to move on to chapter 2. I'm already doing terribly on time, as I could have guessed before, but don't worry, I'll find a way to catch up or just cut myself off. Chapter 2 is called Build, and it is about climate change. And essentially what their argument here, again, thinking about the abundance versus scarcity mindset, pretty much the argument here is that for too long, the democratic ideals around climate change have been, how do we use less energy? How do we conserve? It hasn't been about how do we go build and produce more renewable energy. That has not been the ethos nearly enough. And the example that they go into in great depth here, and I would say probably of all the things that have been pulled out of this book, this is the particular example that gets talked about the most and that they talked about the most in all the press related to the book, is high-speed rail in California, which we can all acknowledge that if we can get high-speed rail in this country to work effectively, to be built effectively, many people will be less likely to drive or fly. And wouldn't that be good for our environmental goals as a country, right? And yet, let's talk about what happened with high-speed rail in this country. I'm going to read a little bit here. In 2009 then, this is page 73, sorry. In 2009 then, this was the status of high-speed rail in California. It was a signature project of the President of the United States. President Obama had just committed significant dollars to it, and the federal government was adding billions more. It is hard to imagine a more favorable climate for the project. A spokesman for the California High-Speed Rail Authority joined a call-in radio show and told listeners that they'd be, quote, able to ride that train from San Francisco to LA in the year 2020. But progress crawled and costs ballooned. In his final State of the State address in 2018, Jerry Brown tried to rally Californians to the task. I'm going to cut some things for the sake of time. Ambitions were cut. No longer was California trying to build high-speed rail to connect the megacities of San Fran to LA. Now it was trying to salvage anything, a line between the agricultural centers of Merced and Bakersfield. A line no one would have authorized if it had been the plan presented in the first place. This scaled-down plan was estimated at $22 billion, but even the price tag on that line has ballooned. The latest estimate says it will cost $35 billion to complete, and it won't begin carrying passengers until sometime between 2030 and 2033, if all goes well. Fast forward to just a page later. In the time California has spent failing to complete its 500-mile high-speed rail system, China has built more than 23,000 miles of high-speed rail. And this is in California. This is in the very place where if any of us have hopes that we're going to be able to build high-speed rail and that there's money by the state to put into it, it would be California. And yet since 2009, we have built a grand total of 0 usable miles of high-speed rail in California. It is, so this is ultimately the argument in their book, or the questions that they ask, is why. And I promise I will make sure that I have time for some of the criticism. But even for the critics of this book, I hope everyone can identify that we should ask why to that question. Why did China build 23,000 miles of high-speed rail in the time that we could not build a single usable mile? We have to answer that question. And they offer some solutions and some remedies. And even for the people who disagree with those solutions and remedies, I hope that they acknowledge it's a useful question and they'll be ought to find some answers for it. So I'd be remiss to not also just add that in this chapter, they do talk about, I want to read one more thing. It costs about $609 million to build a kilometer of rail here. Germany builds a kilometer of rail for $384 million. Canada for $295 million. Japan for $267 million. And Portugal is the cheapest country in the database at $96 million per kilometer. These are real stats and numbers to think about and consider. I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention in this chapter, they do talk a lot about Ralph Nader and the movement by Nader and his loyal band of raiders, who made it their signature position to sue the government. And when Nader was running for president several times, talked about how he was particularly qualified to run for president because no one had sued the government more often than Ralph Nader. And at the end of the day, it is, I talked about death by red tape, it's also death by lawsuits. I mean, they don't talk about how those other countries I described, they don't talk about how litigious those countries are. But I can assure you that the single biggest reason why we cannot build things faster is because, and I see it being inside of government is scared of being sued, and I see it because government is sued all the time for everything, to stop things that individual people who have money in their pockets can spend on lawsuits that they don't like. And that is a functional problem that we're dealing with. Chapter 3 is about politics and government. And they talk a lot about everything bagel liberalism is what they call it, where ultimately government, oftentimes, in particular, leftist governors and leaders generally will say, we want to go create this thing, whatever this, high-speed rail. But when we want to put out the procurement bids for high-speed rail, we're only going to be looking for small contractors, local contractors, minority contractors, women-owned contractors. The list goes on and on and on and on, and that's what they call everything bagel liberalism, where they're trying to solve one problem by asking everything to be a part of it. And it's not that they say whatsoever that it's bad to have MWBE goals. It is not bad. It is demonstrably not bad to have MWBE goals. But there are times where when we need to build things and build things fast, that we can't also make procurement the issue. And the best example of this, given in recent times, is Josh Shapiro. So if we look at page 125, I'll just read that quickly, and then I'll probably jump to some closing comments. On June 11th, 2023, the I-95 bridge in Philadelphia was crashed into and collapsed. Probably all of us remember that. It was a big, big deal. This typically would have taken months, if not years, to rebuild, and Shapiro called for a state of emergency, and it says right here that at the end of the day, he exempted the rebuilding process from the rules and requirements that slow so many public projects down. Speed was the priority. There would be no environmental impact statement. There would be no lengthy bidding process. The procurement rules were shunted aside. And the result is that the I-95 bridge was rebuilt with union labor, mind you, incredibly quickly. And I wanted to give you the exact how long it took, but I'm not going to. 12 days, someone says, and I believe them. And this is what really led to Shapiro's star rising in the Democratic Party. He said, you know what, we have something we need to build, let's build it fast. I'm going to use my power of the pen to say we're going to put aside all these other obligations we have and start making some moves. So that's an example of governance working. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 are about scientific invention, innovation, and deployment of them. And again, this is not the place where I shine, and it's good because I've run out of time. But at the end of the day, what Klein and Thompson argue is that we have made the grant-seeking process for innovation so incredibly challenging. What they say, as a quote, is rules are up, but efficiencies are down. There are more rules to follow, but there is less opportunity for people to actually go find some money. And of course, way worse now, given the cuts by the Trump administration. Way worse now, but there is less room for scientific innovation than there ever was before. So let me end by saying a couple of things. This book is largely about what they call a liberalism that builds. They want us to get out of the problems of housing, of the stunting of housing development. They want us to get out of the problems of signing up and saying we are going to have high-speed rail but not doing it. I took a quick note that in the bipartisan infrastructure bill, there was supposed to be 70, I should actually just give you the actual number. This is on page 213. Don't kill me about time. There was $7.5 billion to build a national network of 500,000 electric vehicle charging stations. That bill was passed in 2022. By March 2024, more than 2 years after the bill passed, only 7 new chargers were up and running. This is the problem that Klein and Thompson want to get us out of. Why are we so good at saying, here's the money we're going to spend on things, but not building the thing? And some of the criticisms I want to particularly call out too, some of the criticisms are that this book, well, the smaller one that let me focus on one criticism for the sake of time. Zephyr Teachout wrote an excellent critique of this book, and I would say a rebuke of this book, saying that it does not focus on the real problem, which is corporate greed. And what she says is that if we focus on antitrust laws and not zoning and permitting reform, which is what this book largely talks about, we'd be in a better shape. Because if, in fact, we did all the permitting reform and made it easier to build stuff, but we still allowed for a small number of giant corporations to own everything, we wouldn't be in a better place. And I'm compelled by that argument. I mean, right now, if we built a ton more housing, but we allowed for a small number of faceless LLCs to control rent by algorithm, we would not necessarily have better and cheaper housing for people. So I am compelled by that argument. I don't think there's a world where Teachout's critique and Klein and Thompson's critique can't live side by side. I think they absolutely can, and they absolutely should if we're going to make any progress in this country. But that's a real criticism that does not talk about the role of corporate greed and monopolization in this book. There's other critiques that I think are very valid, but at the end of the day, I would encourage people to read this book. I hope that every single person who is an operator of local government reads this book, and I will do everything I can to push that. And I hope that the people in charge of our federal and state governments, even if they don't think this book goes far enough, which I don't think is going to be the issue, frankly, I hope that they take this book and they start to actually think about how do we answer these questions. Why is China building 23,000 square miles of high-speed rail when we're building none? Why are we passing $7.5 billion to build EV charging stations and building not $10 worth of them? Why are we building less houses now than we were after the baby boom? Let's answer those questions, and I don't care if your answer is about antitrust or if your answer is about permitting reform. What I hope is that there's answers, and then we start building some more. And with that, I'm at time, but if you guys will ask some questions, I'll take them.